Hello everyone, happy holidays to all of you. Today I'm doing the Reading Diversity tag, which was created by Holly at, I'll insert her channel name here. And I think this is a terrific tag. It's so interesting and I was really looking forward to doing it. I won't get into too much about why I think reading diversity is so important, but just a quick explanation. I think when we talk about stories and movies and films and books and even factual news, I think the way that we tell stories and the stories that we tell repeatedly over time are very influential in the things that we think about the people and certain types of people. And I think over time, negative stereotypes can influence the way that we behave and the way that we see ourselves and see other people. That's why I think diverse reading among different groups and diverse stories within the same group is really important. In the down bar below, I'll link Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's The Danger of a Single Story TED Talks, and I'll also link a couple of Nancy Reid's videos about reading diversity, because I think she does an impeccable job of kind of explaining why it's important and why it's something that needs to happen. The basis of the tag is that you select a continent, all the continents of the world, and choose a couple of books that you want to read that are set in that continent, and then you choose a couple of books that you have read that are set in that continent. Now I must kind of emphasise that this isn't made to make anyone feel bad, but I think it's more about an exchange of ideas, an exchange of stories that are based in maybe places that we don't really hear stories from. So I think that's really interesting. Now that that's over, onto the books. First off, let's start off with some books that I've read that are set in North America. So the first one is Born Confused by Tanuja Desai Hidia. I know for a fact that I've probably butchered that name, so I'm so sorry. Born Confused is about a young woman who is born in the US and raised in the US, and she has Indian heritage. The story basically centres around her being introduced to a suitable boy by her parents, and she's at first very much rejects the notion that she is introduced to this guy who her parents think is perfect for her, and who she is just like, no way. And then further along down the line, she meets him in New York, and she sees him in his own environment, and exercising his own autonomy in his life, and ends up really falling for him. But it gets a little bit more complicated because her best friend starts falling for him too. And it's such an interesting read because not only is it this very sweet love story and a story of friendship and growing up, it also has this great discussion about race and what it's like growing up in the US. It also really touches on parents and how they assimilate into a culture that they're not born into, and how they try and accept and reject certain parts of American culture. Coming over to Central America is The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. This is about Oscar, who is an overweight ghetto nerd. It's about his family and his family history and his family superstitions and the curses, and it's also about experiences living under a dictatorship and what that can actually do to a generation of people's psyches, and how that makes people act and feel, and how that eventually impedes into their own family lives. And for books I want to read from North America and Central America, there's the book called Everything I Never Told You. This is a book that has got tons and tons of rave reviews. It's about a Chinese American family whose daughter is murdered, and basically it is about the unveiling, I think, of what happens, and also it's about their family secrets, their family history, and how they deal with race and identity and things like that. At least that's what I gather, but it's got loads and loads of rave reviews, and I can't wait to read it. By Ruth Izeki. This book is about a girl in Japan who lives in Tokyo, who's bullied, and she's very isolated, and she wants to take her own life. But before she does that, she wants to find a diary written by her grandmother. Fast forward into the narrative, and a woman called Ruth finds the diary washed up on the shore of the British Columbia, and she thinks that it's debris from the Japanese 2011 tsunami. And she reads the diary. She wants to know the end of the story and what happened to the girl. There's also Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. Now this is one that's already got loads of awards. I think it won a National Book Award. It's basically a story told in verse, which I think is so creative, about race relations in the USA, I believe in the 1970s, and it's kind of autobiographical. It's about Jacqueline Woodson's family, and it's about her experiences growing up as a young black girl in the USA. There's also The Book of Unknown Americans by Christina Enrique. This is one that again has got loads and loads of critical acclaim and talk and hype around it. I think it's about a building and the different families that live in the building and their different origins. I think they all have origins from the South, from South America and from Central America, and it kind of details their lives as immigrants and as people growing up in the US. I think at its core there's a love story as well, which I'm always down for. There is also one more book called Seduce by Desiree Reynolds, and I heard about this through an event that I went to in London, and I think that it's about a family who all travel back to Jamaica for the funeral of a loved one, and it basically kind of details their grief and their experiences. And again, it just sounds amazing, and I'll try and find some kind of link to it because I think it's one of those books that you kind of have to dig for. For South America, this is really bad, but I racked my brains and I don't think I've read anything from South America, which is awful because one, that's just really bad, but two, this is an area of the world where the publishing industry is actually really thriving and really growing, and it's a massive market. So I know that there's tons and tons of books there that have been published that I just haven't read. So please come forth with your recommendations because I bet there's just loads that I haven't read. One that I have wanted to read for a while though is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. From what I gather, it's a multi-generational, family-centered novel about a family who live in Chile, and it's their story, but it also is the story of Chile and the social and political upheavals that it went through throughout the 20th century. I think just seeing such change through the eyes of a family, I think is such an interesting narrative device. On to Africa. Let's start with Africa. First book I want to recommend you is the one I'm actually reading now, and that's Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I feel like this is one that a lot of people will cite for good reason because number one, it's quite popular, but number two, it's so good. It's about ostentatiously a couple who are very much in love, and they are based in Nigeria, and it kind of details their story as they grow older, as they come of age. But also it's a book that deals very intricately with race relations, both in Nigeria, both and the USA, and also the UK as well. Another book I've also read is Ghana Must Go by Taye Selassie, and this is a really, really good one. It's again about a family who are all going back to Ghana after the death of the kind of head of the family, the father, and it detailed their backstories and how they became so fractured and so different to the original family that they were before. It's a really beautiful discussion on home and what is home and how your family affects you and whether you can ever really leave them behind. On to books that I haven't read that are set in Africa. The first one is Lagoon by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a book about an alien invasion in Lagos. It sounds so cool. It's got 3 different characters. One is a soldier, one is a rapper, and one is a marine biologist, and it basically details their time when they are kind of immersed in this citywide alien invasion. And I read the first chapter and it sounds so cool, very different, very strange, but also very, very accessible, I think, because it's a familiar narrative but with a different kind of a different setting. The next story I want to recommend from Africa is one called Kintu by Jennifer Makumbi, and this is about a story it's a dual narrative story set in, one is pre-colonial Uganda and the second narrative is set in Uganda in 2004. And it's really interesting because I think it's about generational curses and the impact that that has on families, particularly in their perception of it. Um, but again, it's one that I think you have to kind of dig for, so I'm going to try my best to find a link to it. Coming on to Asia, now the first two books that I want to talk about are both by Khaled Hosseini, The Kite Runner and The Thousand Splendid Suns. Now I love both these books, they are both excellent. The thing that I think always really struck me about Khaled Hosseini was the empathy that he writes with, particularly pertaining to female stories and the experiences that they go through when regimes are kind of inflicted onto countries, and how that doesn't really end when regimes end, or even doesn't necessarily end when characters travel to a Western country with different value systems. There's also The Namesake by Jhumpa Lahiri. I don't really know if this should be in Asia or whether it should kind of move to North America, because the narratives take place both in North America and in India, and it's beautiful. It's such a good story. I never really thought about the experiences that my parents must have gone through when they moved to this country from Nigeria, and I think this book really kind of brought it to the forefront of my psyche. I was just like, it was such a revelation for a story that had really kind of been in front of me for my whole life. Chinese Cinderella by Adeline Yan Ma. Did anyone read that? Because I remember that being quite popular when I was about 12. But it's about a girl who grew up in rural China in the early to mid 20th century, and it's about kind of her experience with her family and how that kind of shaped her, and doesn't very much feel wanted by her family. I always remember this as being the first book ever that made me cry. On to books that I want to read set in Asia, and the first one is Cutting for Stone by Abraham Verghese, and this was actually recommended to me by a friend, which is really exciting, and she said that it kind of details a lot of intricacies about Indian culture, so I'm really excited to read it. This book is about two brothers. The first scene is actually a nun giving birth, which I think it immediately like grabs your attention, and I'm really excited to get back to this. And again, this one has a lot of praise as well, so if you have read it, let me know. Second book I want to read from Asia is Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, also set in India. It's about children who are born, I think, at midnight on Indian Independence Day, and the kind of special powers that they have as a result of that. And I think it sounds really good. It's one that's always kind of popping up on best of lists and classics lists and books you must read by the time you're 30 or die or something like that. So I really want to read this one. I think it sounds really good. Coming over to Oceania is Jasper Jones by Craig Silvey. Whenever I kind of like look it up, it's kind of tutored as an Australian To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a book that I love, and to see anything from that kind of perspective in another country that I don't really know that much about, I'm definitely down for. Coming on to a book that I have read is Does My Head Look Big in This by Randa Abdel Fattah. Does My Head Look Big in This is from the perspective of a girl who recently takes the decision to wear the hijab, and it kind of details her friends' reactions to this, her family's reactions to this, and also just people around her in general, like teachers and acquaintances. And I remember this kind of feeling of not wanting to be the voice of a group of people, but kind of being put into that role by people around you. And I thought it was such a kind of unique thing to put in a book about a teenage girl. That kind of frustration, I thought the author got that across really clearly and really well. It's also really funny and quite sweet as well. I think if you're into YA, you'll really enjoy this one. It's a good one. Randa Abdel Fattah is someone who has written a few books about people of colour in Australia, so I'm really down for reading anything by her, because Does My Head Look Big in This is the only one I've read, and apparently all her others are really interesting and really good too, so I'm completely down for reading anything by her. On to the last continent, and that's Europe. So a couple of books I've read, the first one being No Amid by Delphine de Vigan, and this is about a girl who I think is 13 years old, and who's very intelligent for her age, but she's also quite socially stunted. She feels quite isolated. She has a crush on a guy that's a few years older than her but is in the same class. She meets a girl called No, who's bit older, she's 18, and she's homeless, and she kind of takes her in under her care and under her family's care, and gradually as time goes on, things start to change within the kind of relationships in her family and also within herself. It's really interesting because it kind of takes this perspective, takes this narrative that you think you know, you think you're kind of familiar with, like person comes in and shakes up the family, but also turns it on its head, and kind of questions it and questions its validity and its how authentic it is, particularly when you're dealing with someone who has been homeless and has been troubled and has had struggles. So it's really, really, really good. I like this one a lot actually. Another one I read quite recently is called City of Thieves by David Benioff. This book is quite old. I think it came out a while ago, like in 2006, and it got loads of critical acclaim back then. And it's about wartime Russia and two boys who are given the task of finding a dozen eggs by the end of a certain week, or they will both be killed. And it's hilarious. It's so funny. It's just so weird to say because it's about this kind of war torn, cold as F country, and you know, the harrows and the hardships and the horrors that come with war are all there and they're all very present. But it's also incredibly funny. The narrative is very, very well done, and the voice is very well done. It's very much told from the perspective of a kind of a stroppy teenage boy, and it's so, so good. I really, really enjoyed it. Even though I will say, narrative kind of objectifies women a little bit, and I was a bit like, about that, but overall it's a very, very good book. Follow Me Down by Tanya Byrne. Tanya Byrne is an author who has absolutely kicked it out of the park this year, and she is fantastic. Follow Me Down is a young adult mystery novel about two girls who were best friends, and then something happens with a guy and they stop talking, and then one of them goes missing. And the mystery is kind of figuring out what happened to Scarlett and also who the boy is who got in between them. The main character, Adama, is such a fantastically written character. She's Nigerian and she's from a family of professionals and diplomats, and she comes to England and goes to kind of a boarding school in a very rural part of England, and this is kind of like a disaster for her because she's very much used to New York and Lagos and very urban, very kind of happening settings. There's also Dorothy Coomson, who is a chick lit writer, and she always writes about kind of like second generation black women in the UK. My favourite one of hers is called The Chocolate Run, and it's about two best friends who kind of fall into a relationship, and it kind of deals with them dealing with their own neuroses and dealing with their issues from past relationships, and also just challenging each other's kind of ideals and ideas of love and what it is and what it means to kind of be in a long-term relationship. On to books that I want to read from Europe. The first one is The Shadow of the Wind. It's about Barcelona in the mid 20th century, but it's also about like someone's love of books and what that does and how that brings people together and how it shapes how you are as a person. And I've heard nothing but good things about this, both on the internet and in real life. Next one I actually have out from the library, and it's called Just Like Tomorrow by Faiza Genuine. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong again, but this is about a girl who's 15 years old and whose origins stem from Morocco, but she lives in the place called Paradise Estate in on the outskirts of Paris, and it's supposed to be kind of ironic because she's very kind of fed up with her life, and she's kind of at the back of the book says she basically has to deal with a psychologist that she doesn't really trust, and a first kiss that tastes like crackers, and a mother who is not all there, and social services. I think in terms of its narrative voice, it kind of comes from the same school as Georgia Nicholson and Bridget Jones and Jessica Darling. If you like that stuff, which I love, definitely check this out. And then lastly is in the UK, and there's an author called Bali Rai who writes about kind of South Asian families based in the UK, and he's a young adult writer, and he's he's had quite a long career and he's quite established, and I've always wanted to read him but I've never got round to it, so I'll definitely be checking out some of his works this year. that was the reading diversity tag. Thank you so much for watching. Happy holidays. Recommend me anything galore, and thank you for watching. Bye.